Well, in striking Venezuela and capturing its president, Donald Trump has invoked a policy called the Monroe Doctrine. He's even called his spin on it the Monroe Doctrine, as Trump suggests that he could annex Greenland and take action in Colombia. Well, what does this policy strategy actually mean for what comes next? Monte Francis is here in studio to take us through it. Monte, let's begin with the very simple question. What exactly is the Monroe Doctrine?
Well, Sharon, it dates back to 1823, and the fifth president of the United States, James Monroe, who was also one of the founding fathers. And the basic idea behind the Monroe Doctrine was to keep Europe as a colonizing power out of the Americas. So it began as a hands-off policy, and then under President Roosevelt became a hands-on policy, meaning that the U.S. would take on the role of policing the Western Hemisphere. So bringing this back to what's happening now in Venezuela with Donald Trump is invoking the Monroe Doctrine to explain his actions there. In fact, the national security strategy released by the White House just last month spells that out. It reads, "We want a hemisphere that remains free of hostile foreign incursion or ownership of key assets and that supports critical supply chains. And we want to ensure our continued access to key strategic locations. In other words, we will assert and enforce a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine." And during his news conference on Sunday, Trump made reference to what he called the Monroe Doctrine as he accused Venezuela of hosting foreign adversaries. Let's listen.
All of these actions were in gross violation of the core principles of American foreign policy, dating back more than 2 centuries. And not anymore. All the way back, it dated to the Monroe Doctrines. And the Monroe Doctrine is a big deal. But we've superseded it by a lot, by a real lot. They now call it the Monroe Document. I don't know. It's Monroe Doctrine.
Monte, aside from Venezuela, then the most recent example of the US asserting the Monroe Doctrine, it happened in Panama back in 1989. How was that similar but also different to what's happening in Venezuela?
Yeah, that happened in 1989 under President George H.W. Bush, and it's similar in the sense that the U.S. deposed the country's leader, Manuel Noriega, who was also accused of drug trafficking. It's also similar in the sense that there was an election in 1989 that Noriega was widely considered to have lost, and yet he remained in power. But there are several important differences. Now, first of all, there was already an American presence in Panama. The U.S. military was already there. There was an interest in the Panama Canal. That is not the case in Venezuela, where the U.S. does not have a military presence on the ground or even a diplomatic presence, which is why President Trump's statements about running Venezuela remain so confounding. Another difference is that Noriega's legislature declared a state of war with the United States, not the case with Venezuela. Most important, the U.S. never claimed that it was running Panama. Instead, it installed a government that was friendly to its interests and wanted to at least maintain the appearance that Panama had some sense of sovereignty. Finally, another difference has to do with Panama's size. Panama is a very small country compared to Venezuela, just a tenth of the size of Venezuela. So when Donald Trump talks about running Venezuela, the scale of that task is much different.
And finally, Monte, what does this so-called Monroe Doctrine portend for what could happen elsewhere? We're talking about places like Greenland, Cuba, Colombia, which are the focus of Trump's renewed threats.
Well, that is the big question, and it can't be understated what a huge shift this represents with all the questions of the legality of this set aside. When you talk about the breakdown of the rules-based world order established after World War I and World War II, the whole reason the United Nations was established, the basic idea being that one country couldn't invade another country and then depose its president. And it should be pointed out that this attack on Venezuela by the U.S. is most likely illegal under international law and on its face a violation of the UN Charter, because that only allows for it in the case of self-defense or if it has the approval of the UN Security Council, which is not the case here. Now, earlier today at the UN, the American ambassador defended Trump's actions in Venezuela, and although he didn't mention it by name, he was clearly talking about the Monroe Doctrine. Let's listen.
This is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. And we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States.
So, Sharon, under the Monroe Doctrine or the Monroe Doctrine, the idea is the U.S. would not only police the Western Hemisphere, but actually control parts of it and its resources and keep other players like China and Russia out, which is why there is so much international concern about what this could mean for Greenland, Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, and other countries that Trump has made threats about. There are also considerable concerns about what message this sends to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, who both want to assert control over their spheres of the world.
Monty, thanks so much for all of that. Monte Francis there from our own home desk here at France 24. Well, do stay with us. We'll be back shortly with more world news.